So in this module, we're going to take a look at the global infrastructure, what we mean by that. We'll also take a look at some of the services available in AWS and the categories behind it. Again, we're going to look at what are the elements of the global infrastructure, and then define what we mean by regions and zones. The concept of regions and zones is really critical when you start deploying services in the cloud. So it's a very easy concept to understand, but it's important that you know exactly where your service is going to go for different reasons that we're going to explain. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at an important aspect of cloud management, actually, and it's called the shared responsibility model, which is a critical part of understanding what is managed in the cloud, or what is managed by the cloud, and what is managed by the end user. Okay. So looking at the infrastructure of AWS, there are three components that we are really interested in when we look at the infrastructure, and those are regions, availability zones, and edge locations. Each one is a geographical location, but each one has a different task when it comes to deploying services. So when we look at the foundation services, as we know, services are delivered on demand, and you pay as you go services. You basically pay for what you use, okay? We understand that concept. And some of the major services that you're gonna find within the global infrastructure are the compute power, storage, networking, databases, okay? There are a bunch of many really services in AWS, but this group of four really contains most of the services we're going to be discussing in this course. The only one missing in here will probably be security, which is another big service we're going to be discussing. But really, security applies to anything and everything that runs in the cloud. So this is just a small picture of the main services that you're going to find, services and categories you're going to find in AWS. The different icons represent categories. Within those categories, you're going to find individual services. The main services here, the ones we're going to be highlighting in this class, are the ones in the yellow rectangle. So in future modules, in future lectures, we're going to be discussing each one of those categories in detail. And we're also going to be looking at each of the services available within these categories, all right? And you'll see there are many of them. And this is just a partial picture. As you can see, there are services for game development, for Internet of Things, analytics, media services, and many others. Robotics is not here, artificial intelligence, machine learning, satellite applications. There's so many of them that they're not shown here, and because the services keep growing so quickly. But our focus again will be in this main 5 categories and some of the services within those categories. So when you look at the global infrastructure of AWS, it is important to realize where everything falls in place. When we look at AWS, the general infrastructure, as we said, is composed of regions, availability zones, and edge locations. And then in each of those parts of the infrastructure, we're going to find some of these foundation services available. In this picture, you only see 3 of those foundation services: compute, networking, and storage. And and what that means is that they may reside, those services, those foundation services may reside within the region availability zone of each location, depending on where they are. And each of those foundation services include things like databases, analytics, deployment and management, mobile applications, and so forth. And at the top of this picture, of course, is the end user, which is accessing this services through a machine or a web browser or whatever that is. But our focus again today in this lecture is this red region here, red rectangle. So again, as you see here, and this one we see the categories, but we also see the services available under each of those categories, right? As you can see, each of the categories here, like storage, compute, has several services available. In this class, we're not going to look at all of them, of course, there's not enough time, but we're going to be looking at some of the major ones, some of the ones that are really most popular, and some of the ones you really need, okay? So as we go forward, again, in the future lectures, we're going to be looking at categories specifically the compute category, the storage category, database, networking, and security. These top 5 are the ones we're really going to be focusing on. We're also going to be looking at this one here called cost management, okay? So, and a little bit of, well, more than a little bit, probably about the management and governance. So this will be our focus mainly in the course. The ones that are highlighted are the services we're going to be looking under each of the categories. So going forward, I know this is new to you, but going forward, it's important that you start understanding where the services lie within the individual categories. For example, if you look at, see one that might be a little more obvious to you. If you look, for example, at EC2, well, EC2 stands for basically a server. You know, when you want to launch a server, like a computer, right? The service is called EC2. And that EC2 falls under the compute category. So under that compute category, there's more than just launching a server that you can do. You can do other things, okay? And that's how they categorize the different services and the different options that you have for those services. So going forward, you know, this will be a lot of our focus in the class, most of our focus in the class. So looking at the AWS infrastructure, as we mentioned before, it consists of, or is built around regions, availability zones, and edge locations. And those individual names are meant to designate really a geographical area, and they're located throughout the world. So you're going to find regions, availability zones, and edge locations really throughout the world. And we're going to see a very good picture of this in just a few minutes. And one of the things about the infrastructure, the global infrastructure for AWS, is that they build their own hardware, okay? So, you know, they build their servers, they build their networking components, they build their software. And so that gives them a really big advantage over many other providers, because you know, if something happens to the hardware, they don't have to wait for anyone to fix them, because you know, they the ones who build it. You know, many of the other cloud providers, especially not the big ones, really cannot afford to build their own hardware or software, or develop their own software. But anything that you see in AWS, they own, they built. So it's optimized for workloads run by AWS customers, and that makes it very efficient. So a region is really a separate geographical area, like we said. in a region, you're going to find hundreds of thousands of servers that are kept within what is called physical data centers. Again, these are physical data centers, right? They contain their hardware, thousands, hundreds of thousands of servers. And a region consists of multiple availability zones. Excuse me. And an availability zone is really what has, is also composed of what is called data centers. So, and the data centers are the places where you're going to find that hardware. Okay, and data centers are actual buildings that contain all those hundreds of thousands of servers. So you have, and within the data centers, you have the servers. So you have the data centers. The data centers are contained within availability zones, and availability zones are contained within regions. Okay, so you hopefully start seeing the picture. Each region has at least 2 availability zones and can have as many as 6 availability zones. They're all connected to the global network with a 100 gigabit per second network. And like I said, AWS manages and operates this network and controls it exclusively. Each region is highly redundant, is designed to survive any concurrent failures. The communication between regions uses the AWS backbone network connection infrastructure, meaning that they don't depend on the internet to connect from one region of the world to another region of the world. They have their own infrastructure for making that connection. Currently, there are 21 regions. Again, this number, it's going to change. It changes very quickly, but currently that's pretty accurate with the number of regions that they have around the world. Not all regions are accessible from regular AWS accounts. Some of those regions are designated as GovCloud or like AWS secret regions. They're used by government agencies or US intelligence. And those probably, they won't tell you where they are located. They're secret, but they're also regions that manage and host cloud applications for the government or for other entities like the secret, like the US intelligence service. When you create a service and when you launch data, or when you put data in that service, the data is specific to the region where you created it. It's not replicated outside that region by default, unless you set it up that way. But by default, if I put a data in a region in North America, it's going to stay there. Okay? Obviously, you can always move it, but by default, it's one of the rules that the data is created in the region when you put it in. So AWS never moves your data out of the region. Okay, it is your responsibility, if you want to replicate data across regions if your business needs it, and you are responsible for selecting the region where you're going to store the data in. And this is one of the things where you may want to be aware of any compliance requirements, depending on what data you're dealing with, and also about network latency requirements. In other words, you want to put the data somewhere near where your majority of customers or majority of users are going to be located, so that they can access it, the fastest. When selecting a region, it's important to take into consideration which region will help you optimize latency, like we said, and while minimizing costs. And also looking into any regulatory requirements you may have from any government or from any other agency. So 2 things, because each region, as you'll see later, may have different costs for the same service. So service, if you have a database, for example, and you're running the database in region A, it may be more expensive to run it in region B. Okay, so those are things you got to keep in mind when you have to make the decision of where you're going to put your cloud services, right? And the other one, of course, is latency. Okay, you want to put your services in a region where your customers are going to reach it the fastest as much as possible. And the other third requirement or third thing to keep in mind is that the data that you are handling is that data under any regulatory requirements. Is it you know, by the government, is it required to have it in a certain region, and so forth. So AWS products and services are available by region. That's another thing. Some regions may not have a specific service that you want, a specific product. So, but that's very well publicized, what services and products are available, prices in those different regions, and so forth. The isolated cloud region, which is a special region, is designed to for government agencies and to host you know, sensitive data, and is very bound by regulatory and compliance requirements. So yeah, the regular user don't have access to the cloud. That's the thing, but it's part of the global infrastructure of AWS. And this is a picture of the different regions, the global infrastructure. Is a very useful picture, but more than that, is a very useful, oh, sorry. And what it shows you in here is that if you can look at this live, by the way, we'll look at this live in just a minute, to give you, you know, a real-time details about where each region is located, where each zone is located, where each edge location is located. And as you can see, is color-coded. So orange means a region, and green means an availability zone, I believe. Oh, I'm sorry, blue means an availability zone, okay? And there's many regions and availability zones, and the following slide can show you a sample of them. And the way you recognize the different regions are by, you know, they designated by name like this, like US East Ohio, US East North Virginia, US West North California. But each region has a name associated with it. You can see that in the column, the region name associated with the region name given by AWS. So that I always know, for instance, if I look at EU-West-3, that means Paris, right? If I look at AP-Southeast-2, that means Sydney, okay? So these names here under the region column designate a specific geographical location. That means that that's where your hardware, or the hardware underneath the services for AWS, and that's where your data is going to be located, in the region you choose. But is it interesting if you take a look at this link here, which I'm going to try to bring it up just a minute. I'm not sure if you can see it. Let me make sure you see this. Give me just a minute. I'm going to try to share it. All right, one more time. Doesn't look like you can see that. Give me a minute, guys. All right, so I think now you can see the picture of the AWS infrastructure. And Hold on. All right, so let's give it another try here. And now I hope you can see this, the picture, right? So what you see now is a live picture of the AWS infrastructure, right? There you go. And so what's interesting here, by the way, you can manipulate this globe just if you hold your mouse, anywhere you can, you can go up, down, or, cross, anywhere you want. You can zoom in, zoom out. It's live, by the way. But interestingly, what this shows you is in orange, you see the different regions that are live right now in the AWS infrastructure. Okay, so you see regions all over the world, right? All over, Hong Kong and so forth. Also, if you want, you can get a definition of what a region is by clicking here, and just it'll show you definition of what an availability zone is, and you can see here and what a data center is. Okay, and some of the details about data centers and what they have. So data centers are physical, as you can see in this picture. They're physical locations, right? This is very high security protected physical locations, almost impossible to get through in. But they host the the hardware that runs the cloud services. So you can see here live, right? There are all the regions that you can see. And if we move this a little bit, right? If you look at the blue dots, indicates the availability zones, okay? So within each region, you see the blue dots indicating availability zones. And within those availability zones, you're gonna find the data centers, the actual hardware, okay? The other big picture here is the big element here is the ones in pink. And those indicate, those are called points of presence. And those are also what we're gonna look at later as edge locations. And we're gonna talk later about edge locations, but I want you to understand the concept here, okay? And I'm gonna also review the concept of one of the things you have to do when you choose a region, right? For example, if we this is where we are, of course, and again, if you want, you can zoom in here or zoom out. But this is where we are, right? New Orleans, somewhere in here. Well, this is what is called an edge location, all right? So when I launch services in New Orleans, right? When I start, getting my cloud up and running, the first thing I'm going to have to do is choose what location am I going to have my services running from, okay? Now, sometimes you may not have a choice. For example, if there's a service you're looking for that is only available in certain regions, you may have to go to that region, right? Who knows? Europe, whatever. That's kind of unusual though, because the main services, like the core services we looked at in that picture with the categories and different services, those are available in all regions. But every now and then you're gonna find a service that may not be available in the region you want. So you may be stuck to going to a region far, far away. But the point is, one of the first thing you're gonna do when you start launching services in the cloud is choose a region. Well, and remember I told you before, how you're gonna choose, what are the things, and we'll look at this later also, but what are the things you have to consider when you choose a region? Well, one of the things you have to consider is, well, how far physically from where I am, where my customers are gonna be, or the majority of my sensor information or whatever you're collecting, how far is it going to be from the region I'm choosing? Well, as you can see, we're here, right? Well, there's nothing wrong with choosing Northern California, but really you may want to try to choose the closest region to us, which might be North Virginia, or you may also go with Ohio, right? See? So that's how you start making that decision. Right? I'm going to choose that one because that one, see, is closer to me. It has 6 availability zones, which is shown by the blue dots. See, right here. Right? If I were to choose Ohio, right? Ohio has 3 availability zones here. And by the way, you see there's a government cloud here that is not available to you. And in fact, it has 3 availability zones here. 1, 2, 3. You can see that, right? But that one is for government purposes. But this one in Ohio also has 3 availability zones, right? So, you know, if I'm in New Orleans, I may choose one of those 2. All right. Why? Because I want, you know, I want the least latency, right? I want customers to access my services the fastest. So, you know, you don't want to go, you know, over here, like in Oregon, because you're farther away, right? You want to stay close. So that's what I meant by choosing a closed region. So you see, right? So one of the things I'm going to do first is choose the region. And then the next thing I'm going to do is choose an availability zone, right? Out of the 6, I can choose any one of those 6. Okay. Now, choosing the region and choosing an availability zone is something that you have to do. In other words, you can bypass that, right? You have to have a service somewhere in a geographical location, and you do that by choosing the region and the availability zone where you're going to put your data or your services. Which, by the way, you can put, or you can also choose to have services in different regions, right? Services don't have to be exclusively in one region. For instance, larger companies have their stuff in multiple regions and multiple availability zones, right? You understand that. But anyhow, that's how you will choose it. Now, the thing that is not required to choose are these edge locations, also called points of presence. You see in pink, right? We're going to study those a little later when we look at networking services. But I want you to kind of understand the concept of point of presence, because once we talk about it, you can refer to this picture in your head or look back in this globe and kind of understand what that is. Well, what that is, you know, again, if you have your services here in New Orleans, right, and you choose the Northern North Virginia region to launch your services, right? If you have your customers here in New Orleans, your company or your application, and you choose to run it here in Northern Virginia, let's say that you know, your customers are constantly accessing information which is located here in this region, right? And but they're suffering from some latency for whatever reason, right? Maybe you have a lot of traffic. Maybe your demand has increased a lot, whatever reason. But let's say your users are experimenting latency getting here. Well, one of the things that AWS has is what is called an edge location. And what that means is that, well, if your customers are accessing something here in North Virginia on a regular basis, what you can do is choose one of these edge locations, and what will happen is that the data or the service that they want to access can be cached. Remember, cache means simply they're going to store it temporarily, because if you keep using it that often, instead of your customers or whoever going all the way to North Virginia, they can go here closer or even closer here. Look at this H location, right? And so is one of the things that companies like Netflix uses very much. Netflix is very built around the concept of H locations, because customers then, if you access in some service and it's caching, like a movie, right, it's going to cache that information in a location that is closer to you, right, instead of going to a region. All right, so that's the concept of H locations, and that's what it's basically used for. So you can get to your data, to your application faster, all right, by caching, things that you're doing, right? And so you can access it more quickly instead of going to the region itself. All right, so keep that in mind when we talk about later about H locations, okay? So again, this is a tool that you can use anytime. You can come here and then get a better understanding of what the cloud, the global infrastructure is, okay? All right, so let's look at our PowerPoint again, and I hope that was helpful understanding, what a region is, what a availability zone, a data center, and an H location. I think putting it in picture makes it a lot easier to understand. So each availability zone is engineered to be isolated from failures in other availability zones. They're all isolated, they have their own power, they have their own infrastructure, and is really designed to be independent of any other zone, so that if anything happens in that individual zone, for whatever reason, you lose power or whatever, other availability zones are there, okay? They don't depend on each other. Currently, there are about 76 availability zones. You saw the blue dots in that live picture that we saw. And when they build them, they are placed in locations and they take into account, things like natural disasters. That's probably you don't see one in New Orleans, right? Because we get flooded and whatever. So they put them in places where they think there's at least chance of something really, really bad happening. And again, when you about to launch your systems, you choose the availability zone where you want to go. And like we saw in the picture, it's inside each availability zone, you're going to find one or more data centers. Each one has redundant power, networking, and connectivity, and they're housed in separate facilities. A data center is a location where the actual physical data resides, and it typically has from 50,000 to 80,000 physical servers, so they're humongous, right? In case of failure, automated processes move customer data traffic away from the affected area. They're highly, highly physically secure. Physically you can get in, and logically secure, right? Logically means, they have all kinds of ways for data not to be exposed, for instance. Even though you know where the availability zones are located, the actual data center locations, they're unknown. They're not, they're not publicly displayed or anything. So again, this shows you the concept of regions. And so if this is a region, you will then have, in this particular example, 3 availability zones. And in this availability zone, you have 2 data centers. In this one, you have 2 data centers. And in this one, you have 3 data centers. So 2, 2, and 3. Okay. So, and what that means, again, if availability zones are located within the same region, their communications between them or among them has very low latency. Okay, they're connected, have very low latency, and they use very high-end connections to communicate. So this is your first exercise. Take a look, answer it, and answers are at the end of the module. Number 2, again, pause the video if you want and take your time to answer it. All right, so remember I think it was best that I show you in the picture what an H location was, because if you just start talking about an H location, it's not really that obvious at the beginning. But now you saw the picture, I hope that you understand at least the concept. An H location still has services. It has not all the services you're going to find in a region or in a zone, but it has some services. It's a site where AWS deploys physical server infrastructure to provide low latency access. It's focused on a smaller set of roles, so not as much hardware is needed. At this point, there are 216 points of presence, and remember that's what they were calling that in that globe. Points of presence means it's just a group of H locations, but there are what is called 205 H locations and 11 regional H caches. Well, later we'll explain what the difference is between the two. There's not a whole big difference. They do the same job, but the regional H caches are a little more powerful. And this points of presence are located in 56 cities across 24 countries. And what they do is regional H caches use content for infrequent access. So again, if you have something that you use very often, it's going to cache it in one of those regions instead of going to the, in one of these H locations, instead of going all the way to the region or to the availability zone. So it's a way for the user to get to what they need faster. So when you look at the infrastructure in AWS, it's elastic and scalable. It dynamically adapts to the capacity that is needed. It adapts to the growth that is needed. It's fault tolerant. Has built-in redundancy of all components, and is very highly available. Okay, each region again has their own power, has backup generators, it has their own cooling equipment, and each data center is independently run with their own power supplies. So they don't depend on any of the power grids, because they run their own power. Obviously, at some point, they depend on it for some things, and that's why, the concept of, one availability zone may go down. It's unlikely that they will go down, but it's possible that it will go down. Okay. The other concept we need to understand is an endpoint. An endpoint simply means a particular service. It's something that you can use a program needs to connect to an AWS service. When you start running these services, some of these endpoints are identified by a particular URL. So for example, if you look at this URL here, right? It follows this notation. Okay, in this case, this URL describes an endpoint for the Amazon DynamoDB service. Well, Amazon DynamoDB is a database. Okay, so for now, just think about this describes a database, and it's located in the West region, US West, or the Oregon region. So in many cases where you want to identify where a service is located, you use them by looking at what is called an endpoint. Okay, so this endpoint identifies this particular database service called DynamoDB, and it tells you the location, and it's always followed by Amazon AWS.com. So this is the common notation that is used to identify each of the endpoints, okay, for services. Another example, for example, this one uses the CloudTrail service, okay? So the format is always name of the service, like this one, CloudTrail is a service we're gonna discuss later. and then followed by dot region. And this should be a dot here, by the way, and I'll correct that in the PowerPoint so you'll have it. Okay, so the format should be, again, dot Amazon, AWS.com. So like you can see in this case here, you have CloudTrail as the service. At this point, don't worry much about what that is. But this service is located in US East 2, which happens to be North Virginia, and followed always by Amazon.com. I'm sorry, this one is Ohio. East 2 is Ohio. East 1 is Virginia here. So you can see the region and you can see the service, but in many instances, the way you're going to know where the services are is by looking at these endpoints. And you'll see these endpoints located in many different places, okay? But that's a way to identify where the service is and what kind of service it is. All right, so we talked about before, how do we choose a region? Well, one of the key things that we need to look at when you choose a region is your data, okay? Because your data may be subject to the laws of the country or the locality in which it's stored. Some laws said that if you're operating your business in their jurisdiction, you cannot store that data anywhere else. Well, for most people, that may not be a problem, but for some companies, for some applications, it might be a problem. The compliance standards, such as the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, it's called HIPAA in the United States. They have very strict guidelines on how and where the data can be stored in order to comply. So like I mentioned previously, sometimes you choose a region and you have to bound by these rules, right? Depending on what the data regulation is. So that's one thing to consider. And what this means is that, for example, there are laws that a country follows that tells you where the data is going to go, right? Can your customers' data legally exist outside the country where you're operating? Again, that's something that that has to be considered when, especially if you're hosting or manipulating data that belongs to the government or belongs to certain government agencies or so forth. The other thing to consider, like we mentioned before, is the distance to the user, right? Remember, proximity is a major reason behind choosing your region, especially when latency is critically important. Like I said also before, a lot of organizations choose an initial region closest to the data center or the customers. And some may choose more than one region. If you happen to be in a place where you have two regions located at the exact same distance, then you look at costs, right? One may be cheaper than the other. You also look at services and features. Not all services and features may be available in all regions. Although some services may not be available in your region, you can still use those services within your environment, but then they may have to be accessed with certain latency. But again, these services are continuously changing and new services are being offered. So it's something you need to check. The other thing to consider is cost efficiency. Services cost vary by region. Some services like Amazon S3, and Amazon S3 is just a storage service at this point. So we'll discuss it in very detail later. But this Amazon S3 is a storage service. It's where you put data in. And some of the services may have costs when you transfer data out of the original region. So something to again keep in mind, because the more data you transfer out, the more expensive it's going to be. Also, if you want to replicate your environment across more than one region, is that the most cost-effective solution? It makes it, again, for some companies, it makes a lot of sense to replicate services in one region or two. and those are the big companies really, because you're paying a lot of money for doing that. But at the same time, you know, there are advantages obviously, because you can choose regions so that your customers are always accessing the closest region, whatever they are in the world. And at the same time, if one region goes down for whatever reason, think about 9/11. Right? When 9/11 happened, a lot of services went out in the United States. But if those regions were to go out in the United States, and if you have another region in Europe or Asia or whatever, you can still run your services in another region, right? So again, a very expensive thing to do, but you know, something that you know could make a lot of sense for some company. How many availability zones should you use? Well, the recommendation is to always start with 2 availability zones per region. It's a best practice, because if resources in one availability zone are reachable, your application can still reach a second availability zone. So, and most applications can support 2 availability zones. A lot of companies obviously have more than 2, but 2 is a good point to start. They spread out physically, so you won't receive much benefit from duplicating your resources in 3 or more in the same region, unless you go to a different region, like I said. For example, in this basic model, there's 2 web servers. These 2 web servers, first of all, you have 2 web servers, each located in a different availability zone, right? This one is zone 1, this one is in zone 2. They're identical, and they're running behind what is called an elastic load balancer. We'll have a lot to say later about elastic load balancing. Don't worry about that now. But think about this elastic load balancing as a device that will route traffic depending on certain things. For instance, in this specific example, going back again, you have 2 web servers, one on different availability zones. What this elastic load balancer is doing is checking the traffic of those 2, where they go, where the traffic goes. But if it detects that under normal circumstances, what it could happen is that traffic is going to both web servers, right? Nice, everything is running fine. Traffic is coming from the internet down to the servers, to each availability zone, and this guy is just, letting the traffic go in and out of these 2 web servers. But let's say something happened to this web server, like in this example, it goes down. Then one of the things this elastic load balancer can do is say, hey, this web server, I don't think is healthy anymore. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop traffic going to this web server, and I'm going to move all the traffic to the second one here. All right. So it's one of the things that it does, the elastic load balancer. But as you can see, is an intelligent way of distributing traffic among different applications whenever you feel it's necessary. Okay. And again, that's the nice thing about designing using 2 availability zones, because if this availability zone becomes unavailable, right, you can still do your business in the second availability zone without losing anything, right? This is an example again. This will show the opposite of what you just saw. This will be a single point of failure, because if everything is running in one availability zone and this availability zone happens to go down, then everything goes down. So this is what will represent a single point of failure in this example. Again, this will solve that problem like we saw at the beginning. Same idea, you use a load balancer to replicate your traffic among 2 availability zones. And so if one goes down, you can always route everything to a single one. Okay? Being that everything is the same, right? All right, now we'll look at the concept of shared responsibility model. This is an important concept that you should be very familiar with, especially when you look at the certification exam. The certification exam kind of makes a big deal out of this, understanding what this model is. It's nothing really complicated. It's just something that is important enough for AWS to make it obvious that you need to understand it. And so the shared responsibility model defines the distribution of responsibilities for security in the cloud between the web services and you or the customer. Okay, what is it that when you launch a service, right, and when you start running applications in the cloud, what is it that will make AWS responsible for, and what I'm responsible for? Me being the administrator, the end user, or the company. And that's the distinction they want to make very clear. So the distribution is not static, but varies according to the services deployed on AWS. And basically, AWS is responsible for security and reliability of the cloud, and you, or the customer, is responsible for the security and reliability of what is in the cloud. And notice how the highlighted little words of and in, that's what makes a big difference, right? Again, simply means that AWS is responsible for security and reliability of the cloud. In other words, they're responsible for the physical security of the systems, the reliability of the systems, and you're basically responsible for whatever you're running in those services, right? So AWS, will be responsible for the physical buildings, the servers, and networking hardware in the data centers, and it'll be responsible for the secure of the services themselves, and the power and the maintenance of those systems, right? So take a look in this picture. So it's like that iceberg, right? The top of the iceberg represents what AWS may be responsible for, but underneath that, anything that is in the cloud, the user or you are responsible for. And this applies really for all of the major cloud providers, AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure. They follow the same rules. They will maintain the systems, the physical security, but whatever goes in those services, all of this will be responsible by the company. Okay. So again, the difference between security and reliability of the cloud and what's in the cloud. Under this model, AWS operates, manages, controls the components from the host operating system, virtualization layer down to the physical security of the facilities. And they're responsible for protecting the global infrastructure that runs all the services in the cloud, including the regions, the availability zones, and the edge locations. The physical, those data centers are really, like I said, very difficult to get in. They're guarded 24/7. They have video surveillance and many other ways of keeping secure. They provide real tight hardware infrastructure, including all the servers, storage devices, and they provide a lot of security also to the software infrastructure, the patching, the maintenance of operating systems, the software virtualization, and all that. They provide all that, okay? Including also network infrastructure, all routers, switches, load balancers, cabling, all of that is the responsibility of AWS, and it applies to all the cloud host services that they have. When we look at this model, and later also, it's important to understand also the concept of what they call managed resources and unmanaged resources. Well, this is from the point of view of the cloud provider. okay? So we call a managed resource as a resource that the cloud provider manages, right? So if it's managed, it means managed by the cloud provider. If it's not managed by the cloud provider, it's called an unmanaged resource, okay? So it's a little confusing because, you know, even if it's unmanaged, it still has to be managed, okay? But it just means that from the point of view of the cloud provider, it's unmanaged by them, but it has to be managed by the customer, okay? But that's the distinction they made. So managed resources means that AWS is responsible for just about anything that you need to do to run a service. It hides all or some of the underlying configuration and administration work needed to keep a system running. One example is a relational database called RDS service. And AWS is responsible for patching database, ensuring the data is secure, reliable, and so forth. And another service called Beanstalk that we're going to talk about later in the course. But those are examples of services that are managed because you don't really do much. Once you know all that maybe put the data in, but they manage the infrastructure. They do all the patching, all the updating, all the maintenance of the systems. On the other hand, an unmanaged resource, okay, unmanaged by the cloud, but has to be managed by you, okay, or the company. An unmanaged resource means you're still responsible for most of the administration and configuration. And for example, a server, right? EC2 as a server, basically the name for the server. On the server, you are responsible for maintaining a lot of that server, okay? Once you create it, you own it. And the rule is basically if you can edit it, you own it. So if you can change some of that, you own that. So you manage that. So don't get confused by those two terms, manage and unmanage. They're both managed, right? It's just that the managed resources are managed by AWS. And the unmanaged resources are managed by the companies or the user. Another picture showing the shared responsibility model. Again, the customer is responsible for the data, any platform applications, you know, who gets in, who gets out. That's something that AWS doesn't do. In other words, creating accounts, maintaining password for the users that get into your system. You are responsible for that, okay? In the cloud, remember? Network and other configuration things that you have to do, you are responsible for that. And AWS is responsible for the hardware, the infrastructure, and so forth, okay? So make sure you're familiar with this. Again, it's not a difficult thing to understand. I'm sorry for that. Sorry. But just keep that in mind, okay? All right. And another picture also shows a different way of looking at the model, but also, gives you a different view of what the customer is responsible for in the cloud and what AWS is responsible for of the cloud. Okay. For example, a customer is using Amazon S3, which is a storage service, and Amazon Workspaces. Workspaces is a service for desktop machines and application streaming. They also have a virtual private cloud. A virtual private cloud is a network, okay? And inside that network, what they're saying is that you have a server, an EC2 instance, and a database. And I know there's a lot in these two paragraphs. There's a lot of things here that we haven't discussed, right? But just keep that in mind. You need storage, right? You need a computer, a desktop, to run some application streaming, and you need a network, and the network has a server, and it has a database, right? You understand that, right? So this is just the services associated with those things that you need. So the customer is responsible for managing the guest operating system, the application, and the security groups. And AWS is responsible for protecting the global infrastructure that run all of those services. It is designed and managed according to best practices in industry. And AWS products fall into the category of infrastructure as a service, such as Amazon EC2 and Amazon VPC. Again, EC2 is just servers, and VPC is networking. And so those products are completely under your control and require you to perform all the needed security configuration and management tasks. What that means is that if you're running your servers, if you're running your network, you're putting things in that network, one of the things you are responsible for is to managing who gets in, right? Who has access to those services, who has access to the network, who you're going to allow in, who you're not going to allow. Those are the things you're going to be managing, okay? Also important under this model is to look at something that is called the Service Health Dashboard. It's just a website where you can go. The link is right here, and it shows you real-time information about the different regions, the different zones, and also the, you can see here in the right-hand side figure, if everything is green, means that everything is running fine, right? But on occasions, you may see a yellow or a red if there are problems with a certain region. If there are problems with a certain location, then you can choose, you can see right here on the right, the different region locations. And it's something that is important that you understand that every now and then is something that you need to look at. If something is not working for you, if something is reported as a problem, this might be the first place to go and see, well, is there a problem in the region I'm in, right? And this will show it. So it should make it one of the first steps in troubleshooting service issues. And that's what I'm saying. The other thing you need to be familiar with up to a certain point is the AWS acceptable use policy, which has certain things that you're not allowed to do, for example, or that limits the way you use resources. And some of those are common sense things, like, no network abuse, no illegal stuff, blah, blah, blah. But it's part of the, what they call the shared responsibility model, to be aware that there's an acceptable use policy. And there's a place where you can go for checking the health of the services in the region or zones. Okay, so that's the site again. It's updated region by region. And if you're having trouble again, something is reported with health issues, that's probably one of the first places to go to see if things are running normally. Okay, so this is exercise 3, exercise 4, and the answers to the exercises. And